Hi everyone, we'll be starting in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to the Product Leadership Festival Design Edition hosted by the Institute of Product Leadership. Many of you may have already attended our product edition of the festival and the data edition of the festival. If you are back here with us, I'm very happy to welcome you all back. And some of you may have joined us new. We hope that you have a great experience with us. A warm welcome. We have recorded and shared it with you 30 plus great sessions. You can see on the screen. The recording is available on this URL. Please check it out. Before we go on to today's session, let me give you a quick intro to the Institute of Product Leadership. So the Institute is a B school for technology and product innovators. The vision is to build a great team of, great ecosystem of product leaders, data leaders, and design leaders in India. As you can see on the screen, we have partnered with 4 universities, including the University of Houston in the United States. We have 2,000 plus successful alumni heading great business units all over the world, and we work with most of the Fortune companies. Now, I'm very happy to come to the screen. As you can see, we have put together a great lineup for the day today. So at 8 p.m., we will start with Adam, and then at 8:45, Param, and 9:30, Payal Arora. So these sessions are going to be 45 minutes sessions, and we are not giving any big gap between these sessions. So stay with us throughout these sessions, and don't go anywhere. I'm sure you will have a great time and great knowledge listening to all of them. So on the 13th of June, so this festival is from 9th today until the 13th of June. So on the 13th of June, we have an open conference day. So many aspiring speakers, as you can see on the screen, they have nominated themselves and they have come up with great topics. And people who gather most votes, they win the session, or they get to speak at this festival. So 2 people will be chosen. And please go ahead and cast your votes and make your favorite person or topic win. And this will give you an opportunity to win some exciting gifts also. Here is another opportunity for you to win some exciting prizes. So refer your colleagues or friends, etc., and climb up the leaderboard. And again, we will keep it a surprise what you will win. Now, this is the most important part. So every question, we have a dedicated LinkedIn thread where you can ask your questions. So please scan this. I'll give you a moment here. Please scan this QR code, and this URL, this LinkedIn thread will be available in your chat window also. So please ask your questions for Adam's session here, here in this LinkedIn thread alone. The reason is, even after the session is over, the questions and answers will remain in the LinkedIn thread. It will be useful for so many people who are looking for answers. So please ask here only, and please scan this QR code. Now, coming to tonight's session, I'm very, very excited and happy to welcome Professor Pinkesh Shah, who's the moderator of this session. So Professor Shah is senior faculty at Institute of Product Leadership. So most recently, he was ex-VP Global with McAfee. Without further ado, I hand over the session to Professor Shah.
Hey, thank you, Menka. Hope the voice is loud and clear, and a very awesome evening to folks in Asia, and an awesome morning to folks in the United States. What a great way to start the design festival, kind of designed to create a community for designers. Then to welcome our first speaker, Adam. Adam, if you are here, if you want to turn the video on, so we all can see you as well. Awesome.
Hello.
Welcome. Good morning there. Adam is, amongst many other things, he's the director of community and design leadership at InVision. InVision is not a new name to any designer. It's a household name in the design circles, especially the product circles as well. Adam is passionate about design. It shows, and I'm sure we're going to enjoy a lot of the insights that he's going to share. But besides that, he's also been a pioneer in launching designbetter.co, the design leadership forum. He has now built a community that kind of connects over 3,000 product design leaders worldwide, as they share and build this ecosystem of design best practices and principles all around the world. He's also the author of the Design Leadership Insights Report. I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit about that as well. More interesting, he's a recovering restaurateur. He is a broadcaster. By the looks of his room and the little guitar that I see at the back, I'm sure he is a musician as well at heart. A multi-talented personality. Warm welcome, Adam. All yours.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm about to share quite a bit about me, and I always like to know who I'm talking to. I'm going to be checking out the chat throughout today's session, but if you could just really quickly jump in and say hi if you're new to Zoom. I would encourage you under the to area, make sure that you click to all panelists and attendees, and just let me know where you're watching from. That'd be awesome just to see who I'm talking to. So great. Is it okay if I...
Yeah, one of the
Sorry,
things I was gonna say, Adam, if it helps you, we were gonna ask this question a little later, but we can do that now. Is to put a little poll. So the team can put the poll, poll number 1 on the screen. This will hopefully allow Adam to also, visualize who is in the audience in terms of the profession or the work area.
Perfect. This is great.
So what's the latest experiments with music, Adam? I see. I see
I I like to make a lot of noise, and sometimes it sounds organized. So most of the time I spend time playing piano downstairs, and if I'm really in a great mood, then the guitar comes a little bit more naturally. But yeah, I usually am just playing piano in the house. And I'm looking at these poll results start to come in. It's about the type of audience makeup that we were anticipating, which is really cool. Just for the sake of time, is it okay if I start diving into the presentation and do a screen share?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Let's go ahead and get started. All right. So if I've done this right, everyone should see dark mode over here on the left. Is that right?
Yes.
And now you can see the title slide. Great. All right. So thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Adam Fry-Pierce. I'm the director of customer experience programs here at InVision. Now, I'm going to be mentioning InVision quite a bit today. If you don't know what that is, we're a software company. We make collaboration tools for product design teams. And when these tools are all used together, this is where essentially we're the modern operating system for the digital team. Now, I've got a really unique role at InVision. I sit on this team called the Design Transformation Team. And in that, I've had the opportunity to consult with dozens of enterprise product teams throughout the years. And I really get to see a really intimate look as to how they build products. Now, I also oversee this community called the Design Leadership Forum, not dissimilar to what y'all have here, except for specifically in design. What this is it's one of the world's largest quality communities of design leaders from enterprise environments. So there's over 3,000 members. It's a private community, and we represent most of the Fortune 500, a lot of the Inc. 5000. And I say all that to say I've seen underneath the hood of enough product teams to really have a sense of what good product teams look like. And I can tell you it's not luck, it's not chance. Good teams are designed. And one of the key components to the best teams is to be able is the ability for the entire team to be able to do their best work, specifically the designer. But for some reason, so many product managers and designers they really struggle to make the most out of their relationship. And so what I'm here to do is to help you understand how, I just saw from the poll, there's mostly PMs here, how PMs in particular can make the space for designers to do their best work. Now, at the end of the presentation, if you find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with anything that I have to say here, please let me know, because this thing that you're about to see, it's a story that's constantly evolving, and that happens with constant feedback. So if you'd like to get a hold of me, here's my Twitter handle. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Just go ahead and shoot me a message and let me know what you thought. And I'd love to incorporate your ideas into the next iteration of what we're doing here. But for today, here's what we're going to cover. All right, so we're gonna really quickly, I see here again, it's not all product managers who are on the call here. So we're just gonna really quickly get on the same page and align on like, what is the optimal product team look like? And what's the role of the product manager there? And what's the role of the designer in particular? And then we're gonna get to the highlight. We're gonna go over the 5 tips for PMs to better unleash the value of design. And then last, I'm gonna give you some resources as to how to just help you in the road ahead. So let's dive in. What is the modern product team? So this is what a lot of people will refer to as EPD. And that's your engineering, your product manager, and your designer. This is what other teams call the squad. And that's what we're calling the squad. Envision just produced a film all about the relationships here that happen. What this really is it's the core team that oversees a portfolio, a product, a feature set, in some cases a zone. And sometimes there's other disciplines that are part of this as well. Depending on the context of what you're solving for, that could be somebody in marketing or somebody in data. But at the core of every squad, every EPD typically is the designer, the product manager, and the engineer. So when I reference squad today, I'm really talking about those 3 functions. Now, like I mentioned, I sit on this thing called the Design Leadership Forum. Absolutely honored and privileged to be overseeing it. And we poll our community quite often just to get a pulse of, what are the top design leaders in the world thinking about? What are the trends that they're solving for? What does their team look like? And in a recent questionnaire, we asked, what's your typical ratio? You've probably seen something similar to this. Maybe the ratios are a little off, but probably similar. And that was that we heard from design teams that for every product manager, there's typically 8 engineers, maybe 10 engineers, and 2 designers. Now, let's really quickly talk about the PM of today. Everybody is from product management. So if you aren't, here are the 3 archetypes that we're going to talk about throughout today's session. Let's just align really quickly. This is from McKinsey. Here they share their view on what those 3 archetypes are. You got technologists who, no surprise, their focus is on technology solutions. And then in the middle here, you have what I identify as, which is a generalist. McKinsey likes to call this the focus on user delight. I like to prefer to say user value. And then you have the business-oriented PM that's all about maximizing specific business metrics. Now, if you're on the call as a PM, there's a really good chance that you find yourself identifying with one or more likely all of these. These are just supposed to be primary representations of a particular mindset, but not at all supposed to be the only bucket where a specific PM falls under. Like any business owner, which is essentially what a product manager is a mini business owner. They work across multiple areas. So for me, I'm heavy towards the generalist type, and then I'm business oriented on the back end, with technology being the third type of personality that I represent. And for several other PMs on the call, you might be the complete opposite. 80% of your mind share might be more weighted towards the technologist. The point is that PMs typically blend in between all 3 of these, and that's pretty much it for everyone who's not on the call. Hopefully you have a really good idea, or who's not a PM on the call. Hopefully you now have a better idea as to what we're talking about here. So let's talk about the role of the designer really quick. Now we should pause here. The answer to this question was different 10 years ago, as much as it was different 2 years ago, and certainly different 6 months ago. We're kind of in this new era, ever since the coronavirus has hit, and there's been this global pandemic, and the rolling economic shutdowns, we're in this thing now where the world looks really similar to what it looked like before, but it's different. Consumer behaviors are different. People take themselves through the world a little bit more guarded, and that ends up impacting all of the products that we use, right? And how we use them. We're in this thing that I like to call the social distance economy. And squads have to be asking this question, how can you best understand the ground as it's moving underneath your feet? And since the pandemic hit, I heard from product teams everywhere, and I'm sure this is true for you too, you've had to, completely throw away your roadmap, that you've had to patch it up, burn it down, you name it. The point is that the way that roadmaps were set up previously, they were a bit too rigid for the environment that we've entered this year, where everything changed just enough to really alter the course of our plans. And I've heard from a lot of PMs, especially in the last few months, that they feel like in order to answer this question, which is one of the most important questions you can answer, is that you're going to have to rebuild your org, rebuild how your squad operates so that you can better understand that changing landscape. And from the PMs, they've said, hey, if I can do this, if I can change the organizational makeup of my squad, then I feel like we're going to be in a better position to connect with our customers and just overall better track the changes in our customers' behavior. And where I like to say is, enter the designer. This is where the designer is uniquely educated and skilled to be the constant voice of the customer on your squad. In the time of coronavirus or not, this is true, but it's especially true now. And the designer's background just puts them in the perfect position to help your squad mitigate any go-to-market risk. Now, a lot of people, I'm not saying you necessarily, but when you hear design, you probably just think of this, right? You probably hear of, you think of a logo, or you think of, design as the thing that you wrap around really profitable code to make it look nice. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. Design's so much more than that. Design is layered down to where, if you go from UI down to interaction, it's the way that a customer will end up going through a certain app that you have built. Below that, you have service design, which is really all about mapping out things like, customer service lines, which are the best ones are designed. Anybody in professional services will tell you that service design is a key part of the differentiation of what makes for good service and bad service. Further down the iceberg, you have things like user research. And then when design is really used at its most broad and most capable, you have this thing called experience strategy, where a designer is brought in to solve the problem of the second that your target customer starts to think about the main problem that you're trying to solve for, how do you end up nurturing them into your product? And then how do you end up converting them from your product space into becoming a customer for life? The designer, when used at their best, is part of that conversation, and it's very purposeful, and they do have a place there. So I could spend the rest of this time talking about what the designer is and what it isn't. I'm sure there's going to be other great sessions here that are going to do that, but I just wanted to really quickly align on the modern squad, who the PM is and who the designer is and what they can do. So let's just really quickly dive into the meat of this conversation today, the core of it, which is your 5 tips on how to unleash design. I'm going to go over these 5 areas. We're going to talk about the idea of how important it is to mature design practices, which really is just to say how to mature your entire squad's practices, but be intentional about that investment. We're going to talk about roadmaps and how the most rigid ones just aren't really built for the quick moving world that we're in today. We're going to talk about stakeholder alignment, how to do that. We're going to end here on some of my favorite areas, which are squad culture and team rituals. So let's start with this entire idea of, design maturity and what you can do. I'm assuming that most people here are kind of mid-level product managers. So what can you do to inspire leadership to actually invest more into maturing your practices? Now, I want to bring your attention to this right here. It's a study that Envision did last year. I'm holding it up right now. If I'm on audio, you won't see it. But what this is it's the world's largest study on the impact of organizational design maturity as it correlates to business. And you've probably heard of McKinsey's business value of design, or the Design Management Institute studies that talk about the value of design. Most of their sample sizes are a few hundred. There are a few hundred companies, we went just kind of all out here, and we just wanted to blow the data set out of the water. So we ended up surveying 2,200 companies, most of which were enterprises from 77 different countries and over 24 industries. And what we found is that this thing that people have been saying forever, there's value to design, that it turns out that there's statistical correlation between a company's ability to adopt design, meaning unleash those design practices, and the benefits of design, meaning the more that they invested into design, the more money that they saw on the back end of their return. So this is to say that, in the typical equation of a low mature team where one designer plus one product manager equaled, a given output, let's call it 2. For high mature environments, 1 + 1 ends up equaling 3. Now, the other part of this study is that we end up really getting an idea of where the world laid out, right? We had a huge sample size. So where are most of the enterprises, the agencies in the world? They're on the lower end of the spectrum. There's still a ton of work to be done. At the core of this study, you had 5 different levels of maturity, one being a low mature team, therefore giving low business value back to their organizations who are investing in them. And then on the upper end, you had a level 5 team where design is really being unleashed across the business and able to realize its potential. But what we end up seeing is that a level 3 and below team was what we're coining as low maturity, and a level 4 and 5 is what we coin as high maturity. This is really important to keep in mind for the rest of the talk. I'm going to be doing a lot of low maturity to high maturity comparisons. But here's the thing, is that product managers, designers, organization, anybody who's in charge of operations, you have tons of job security, because what we found is that 83% of the data set is still low mature, which means that only a select group of companies are really receiving the value that they can with their design investments for the business. Although 80% of companies had reported in our survey that they do usually include design on projects, either often or always, only 5% were empowering design to receive the greatest benefits, and 41% are level 1 companies. So they have significant room to grow. There's low hanging fruit. So this is really good news. Now, let me give you a quick idea as to what this looks like for a high mature team versus low mature team. I talked earlier about the squad. Now, a few of you might even already be worried, like, my designer doesn't actually sit on my team. That's okay. But if they end up sitting on your team, you'll see that at a level 5 company, a high mature organization, that we see that design is 3 times more likely to be sitting with their counterparts in engineering and product management. I'll provide the source of the data at the end of this. But we had a previous Forrester analyst be leading this entire initiative. There's lots of good data points for you to chew into here. We also saw that designers were 4 times more likely to develop key products and features within their key business partners. Now, for any business-oriented PM on the call, this is your slide. This is where you want to be taking screenshots. High design maturity end up delivering complete outsized benefits compared to low mature teams. We saw that where there was investment for high mature teams, that there was 4 times the amount of return on revenue versus low mature counterparts. There was 5 times the amount of cost savings compared to their low mature counterparts, because a high mature team has things where design gets systematized. You see design systems being operated. You see DevOps and design ops working in tandem together. So it's not surprising that there's a huge cost savings for more mature practices. Your time to market, you're 6 times faster to go to market if you're operating with a designer close to your squad in a high mature environment. And for every business owner here, this should really get you excited. There is a 26% or 26 times more likelihood to impact things like overall shareholder valuation through certain outcomes that have outputs of design patents and IP specifically for that company in high mature environments. So that's all to say that design is the differentiator here. When design becomes completely integrated into the core of the business, you find that brands deliver consistent and excellent customer experiences. And in companies like these, design is empowered to influence the business strategy, to drive customer research, to lead experimentation, and ultimately transform the overall CX. And once design is this deeply integrated, either into the company or into the squad, you see that outsized business growth occurs. And don't just take it from us. Let's look at some other studies that are out there. You had IBM, which is probably the biggest example of a single company who has invested into design, report with their work with Forrester back in 2018 that they saw 75% reduced design time within their squad. They saw a third less time spent for development cycles, and overall their time to market reduced by about 30%. Pretty spectacular. This is all just the business case as to why you need to be investing into maturing design practices and help create the space. If you don't oversee design yourself, this is where you should go inspire leadership to be investing into maturing practices in general. This doesn't happen over a day. You'll be lucky to see increments over a quarter. This is long-term planning that ends up really taking place over a year or maybe even years. And if you're wondering like, well, I want to know how can I just do a gut check? You can go out there and do audits and surveys and all that stuff. But if you wanted to just give yourself a quick check, here's what level 5 squads do. Everybody on the team shares a quotable North Star, meaning if you went and asked your engineers, your designers, or other PMs, why are you here, that they might say the same thing, or at least that it's similar. You'd see that the way that they talk about their business and about their products has shared vocabulary, that there's not all the inside baseball terms that are gated for designers, engineers, or PMs, that everyone's talking about things using the same language. You'll see that the lines of design, product, and engineering, that those lines start to blur a little bit within the where the work actually happens, that the workflow is typically connected through a central set of tools and platforms. You see that the squad has rituals, which we're going to talk about today. And you also see that they're typically measured by the same metrics. They all know what success means, and they can all, if asked that question, what does success look like in a quarter or in a year, that they'll say the same thing. So what can you do? That's a lot of information. Great. There's validation as to why we should be investing into design practices, but what can I do about it, right? Here's my simple challenge. If you have a model where design is not embedded into the squad, I would advocate for a squad experiment. I would go to product leadership. I would show them the industry proof. You have this study, which you're going to have a reference to by the end of this talk. And you have plenty of other studies out there. The McKinsey Business Value of Design is a great one. Check out the Design Management Institute. There have been reports after reports that show that the investment pays off, but that has to be a top-down leadership initiative. And if you end up getting pushback, I would encourage you to experiment with work streams. Now, this isn't a new idea. Really, it's an organizational design concept where you take a small experiment into a small group without really having to do a complete reorganization, and you run that test, and then you compare the results to tests outside of a work stream. I would say take a product or a feature, take a sprint cycle and do it with a squad model and see what the outputs were on the other side. You're likely to see that there was less friction during things like handoff, that communication happened a little bit more steadily, and that you're overall just saving iteration cycles. I would encourage you to run a workstream experiment. Now, if you do have a squad model and you're thinking, well, how can I do this? I don't oversee the budget for people ops or development. I would encourage you to go back to that slide that I just shared, and I'll share this deck with the Institute so you can go reference it. But I would focus on workflow. How is your tooling? Are the teams actually set on a shared KPI or OKR structure? Do you have a single North Star? And just run that test. Go ask the rest of your squad, why do you think we're here? And see what they say. And if there's inconsistencies, that gives you an idea as to what you should be focusing on. Another one that I would encourage you to check out is reconsider your roadmaps and your rituals. And this is one that we're actually going to talk about today. And, as luck has it, we're going to talk about roadmaps right now. So tip number 2 is evaluate the way that you roadmap. Like I said earlier, the times right now are really uncertain. Like we're in a whole new economy. And as such, your roadmap needs to be flexible. Roadmaps need to be able to respond to change, and your squad needs to be able to challenge your own assumptions and conducting continuous research as well as validation. One way to accomplish this is to subscribe to a more flexible roadmap. I like to use the outcomes-based roadmap, which favors outcomes over outputs. Traditional roadmaps are essentially a push model, right? They're all about releasing specific features by specific dates. and requirements come from the top down and they make their way into your backlog. But as we shift towards thinking more about outcomes, we find ourselves operating more in a pull model, and things change for the better. We make product decisions and prioritization based on customer feedback first. And because people are elastic, their behaviors change. So must the roadmaps. They can't be static. They're too rigid for how the world operates today. If there's one thing that 2020 has taught us, it's that, or at least taught product teams, it's that your roadmaps have to be flexible. So let me take you there. Here's an outcomes-based roadmap. There's lots of great resources out there. I borrowed this one specifically from VMware's design field guide that they published last year. This is such a flexible roadmap that should be able to help your team. Now, this tool shifts the conversation away from features, and it makes it all about the customer. It forces your squad to prioritize the change in customer behavior that you're trying to achieve over a set of features or the product itself. So here's the key components. Up here in the left column, you've got the current time horizon, which is from now to the next 3 months. And then in near term, you have 3 to 6 month time horizons, and then future is 6 months and out. And the further out that you go, the less certainty that you have, and so the less features or solutions that you need to have planned. Now, this type of roadmap makes customer research absolutely critical. This does not work if you're not interviewing customers, often. So first and foremost, you have to subscribe to customer research. I would be running a quick sprint to gather that research, gather customer input, depending on what problems that you're trying to solve for. Once you have those problems, you being the great PM that you are, you can balance what those problems are against what the business needs, and then prioritize which ones you're able to solve right now, soon, and long term. So take the one that makes the most sense for the business, and that goes here on your left column. That problem is what you are designing for. And then comes in the outcome part of the roadmap. We are moving to the thing that you are actually trying to focus on, the behavior that you're changing for, since that's what design is all about anyways, right? It's trying to change human behaviors. So what you need to do with this roadmap is articulate which behaviors you're trying to change and design for, and then you're going to identify how you're measuring success. And then, and only then, do you spend time with your teams iterating on what features or products that you can do to bring this to life. And then you validate those features with your customers. Again, more conversations. And you repeat this process for the near term and the future term. And voila, you have your outcomes-based roadmap. Now, I recommend visiting this roadmap often to check in. Some teams do this daily. And some teams do this on a weekly basis. I would recommend that you, regardless of your cadence, that you do this on a semi-regular basis, and you also use this as a platform to take back to your stakeholders and align, just to make sure that everybody's really on the same page, so you don't have what people lovingly call swoop and poop later on. So how can an outcomes-based roadmap really help? The bottom line is, use frameworks that are flexible. That's the biggest takeaway of this tip. And the outcomes-based roadmap can help here. It's going to help you align on product and vision and strategy from day one. It's going to allow you to keep focused on a single outcome at a time, moving the metrics incrementally. It's going to allow you to prioritize based on business and user value. And it's going to establish alignment with the other stakeholders and teams because the tool is meant to be socialized, which is perfect into our third tip, which is aligning with stakeholders. Now, I might be the first one to say this during the conference, but I certainly won't be the last. And that's that stakeholder alignment is critical. And I'm sure you know this already, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. But something that you might not know is design leaders from the Design Leadership Forum, that community that I oversee, they reported that some of the largest blockers of overall squad alignment, it stemmed from the top line squad leaders, the top line EPD leaders being misaligned. And it is common for engineering, product, and design to actually be measured differently, and that's okay. But you have to know how these goals end up rolling down to your individual team members. So how can you do this? While PM is the direct line to stakeholders, you should naturally be the person to align with them. But remember, it's up to the squad to clarify exactly who should be doing what. So you need to align on roles. So when the question comes up as to who's going to be aligning with stakeholders, remind everybody that the PM is in the best place to do so. Just like design has their role, they're in the best place to be the customer voice and to best be connecting with the customer. You are in the best place to connect with the business, but you have to clarify that role first. Now, number 2 is whether you use outcomes-based roadmaps or not, be sure to use some sort of planning framework that makes room for stakeholder input early and often. And this is the best way to keep stakeholders from focusing on things like features or prioritizing the backlog. It's important to note that creating a successful outcomes-based roadmap is really all about setting achievable and desirable goals. So work really carefully to define those intended results and then ground them in reality. The third one, there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of different ways that you can solve a problem. For your team to be able to find the best solution, they need to be able to experiment with different solutions and then validate them with customers. This is where you can collaborate closely with your designers and de-risk your go-to-market. As the direct line to stakeholders, you must once again clear the space for your squad to experiment. And this is a good time to err on the side of permission rather than ask for forgiveness. The last thing you want to do is run a bunch of experiments in a vacuum without anyone knowing about it. So if I were you, I would make a very quick business case and tell your leadership why you should be building experimentation into the way that your squad operates, that you're trying to become more of a customer-driven decision-making group, and that you're trying to just bring the customer into the DNA of how the squad operates. Now, I'll give you some bullet points in just a second if you need to give a business case on why experimentation matters, but that's the point here. Lastly, I would really spend some time defining your success metrics. Again, no surprise to anybody here, but I just wanted to reinforce that for any of the newer PMs, make sure that you're really tracking success metrics and then communicating them to your team and your stakeholders. It doesn't really matter which alignment framework that you're using, but it is critical that your outcomes are measurable. If you don't state a target, it's really hard to say if you hit the goal or not. So communicate your progress or goals against your stakeholders. Now, I mentioned experimentation. A quick note, remember that new Design Frontier report? This made a really clear case for why squads should constantly be investing into maturing their practices, specifically with experimentation. We learned that the best squads in the world, the best teams that we're all familiar with, I won't name brand names here, but they're ones that developed cultures of constant experimentation. And the business results speak for themselves, right? Companies that embraced nonstop experimentation were 6 times more likely to decrease their time to market and 4 times more likely to have an impact on revenue, which PMs, that's like what we're all about, right? Is trying to make our business impact really clear. Experimentation will help you do that. All right, tip number 4, coming to our last 2 tips here. This one's a little bit softer, and go with me for a second. I encourage you this week to ask yourself a single question. How much conscious and cognitive energy are you putting into shaping your squad's culture? Most of us work 160 hours to 200 hours a month. And many of you are working to are probably not answering questions like this, like how are you molding your culture? And I would encourage you to reconsider how you're using some of your time here, because there is a clear link between outcomes and culture. According to the Leader's Guide to Corporate Culture, culture curation is one of the best areas that you can spend as your time as a leader. And this is it's a difficult to control area, right? Like who influences culture? My stance is that the higher up in the organization that you go, the more influence that you have. And as a member of your squad, you, whether you know it or not, are already impacting the culture and what it feels like to work on that squad. So I encourage you to have a mindful and purposeful impact on your squad's culture rather than an ignorant one. And after all, research and practical experience has shown that when you're evaluating how culture affects outcomes, which is, again, the context and how the organization operates, things like geographic region, industry, strategy, leadership, company structure, it matters. The strength of the culture matters quite a bit. And again, tough to measure, but really easy to feel. And there's not going to be a one size fits all here. Depending on your industry or on your company or your team, it may make sense to have a different culture type. And there's certainly different types. Not all squads should be modeled the same. I would encourage you to check out this resource at the Harvard Business Review. Just Google the culture factor in 2018 and you'll see this chart. Further on in this article, you'll learn that there's different archetypes for different types of teams. Now, depending on your industry, like I said, or on your team, it may make sense to have a different kind of culture. For any new product leader here, any new product manager, I would encourage you to set up a culture like this, or you may want to really be dedicated as a servant leader towards creating a space of learning, enjoyment, and results, so that you and the rest of your squad can end up really owning the culture curation together. According to authors of How You Shape Your Culture, this model can end up leading to individual team satisfaction, engagement, and retention, which, and here's why this really matters to you, this ends up creating a squad with a higher likelihood to create more impact over the span of the year, because you're just not doing things that a general PM might be having to do, like filling headcount that you just lost because maybe retention is an issue at your company or on your squad. When you have those things like engagement, individual satisfaction, and retention, your output and your outcomes are going to be of higher quality than those that put more of an emphasis on things like order and authority. So how can you do this? Culture is, again, a really squishy area. I would encourage you to start by simply talking to your team about what you want to become. And if I were inheriting a new squad, here's what I would do. I would carve out space real early in some of our team meetings to ask this question, to have an open discussion. What do we want to be? And this can probably just take a few days, maybe a week. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, this is like no time at all, right? It's a drip in the bucket and totally worth it. I would invite your team to build this with you as well. And if you do have a designer that you're trying to figure out how to bring closer to the fold, ask them to help you facilitate the exercise. There's 100% chance that there's going to be whiteboarding sessions in these activities. They know how to do that. And if you give them the problem that you're trying to solve for, they have an entire toolbox in which they'll know exactly which activity and exercise to help bring out to help you solve the problem. I would just share your goals for the session with them and figure out, exactly how you're going to accomplish that together with your designer. And if they can't do it, don't worry. There's plenty of easy frameworks out there for you to adopt. I would encourage you to Google the V2 Mom framework from Salesforce. It's in the book's not next to me. I should grab it, but it's in the Salesforce playbook that was published a few years ago by Mark Benioff. Now, the third way that you can help is during the activity. Remember, you probably don't need to start from scratch. You really don't need to reinvent the wheel here. You can use your company's principles and vision statements as a starting point, right? It's up to your squad to translate how the top line company principles end up impacting you at a team level. For example, let's use Tesla. If I go back a slide, Tesla was one that is a company that's committed to being a learning organization, and they are very purposely trying to create a culture of learning. It's built into their vision statement. So if your squad works at Tesla, what does that mean for you? What does that mean, for your daily stand-ups or weekly stand-ups? Does this mean that you do things like creating micro training sessions so that everybody can really quickly talk about something that they learned this week and try and teach each other? Does it mean that you're investing in things like communities of practice? How the top line principles and visions translate to your squad are really up to you, but that's the cool part of this, is you get to contextualize those values and really put it to work to see how it's going to manifest for you at a team level. Now, the last one is probably the most important. Let's say the rest of this stuff doesn't work. This last one is the one thing that you should be taking away, perhaps from this entire presentation, but certainly this slide. It does not matter if your company doesn't have this, but make sure that you create a place where you can have candor and open feedback built into your DNA of your squad. And it can really just be that simple. A core principle for your team to be honest and be committed to candor is all you need. And if this principle can end up having, effects beyond what the obvious are, which are, people conflicts, we can help solve problems more easily, but it goes way beyond that. You end up creating a space where the team is committed to feedback first. And that means that it's committed to stakeholder feedback, to customer feedback, and peer feedback. And this becomes really easy to do if everybody agrees from the beginning that a core principle is candor. I'll give you a quick example as to how this can help. Now, at InVision, we have this as a top-down principle. I've lived through this, and I can tell you it makes a big difference. The way that people use it at our company is pretty inspiring. When we have an all-hands meeting where our CEO says something that maybe somebody disagrees with, because we have this principle built into the fabric of our company, we actually have these printed out cards that sit next to our desk, and we can hold up a principle saying, hey, a moment of compassionate candor. I disagree with something that you just said. And what that does is it essentially allows the person that's holding that card to wear that principle like armor. Ego no matter, or is no longer part of the conversation. We're able to have a discussion about an objective idea and discuss its merits rather than focus on the person or the context in which the idea is stemming from. So that's all to say is, really dedicate yourself to understanding the idea of candor. If you need a book, check out my screen right now. This book is all you need. Radical Candor by Kim Scott. I will say too, in the Design Leadership Forum, this book, we ask all the time, what's a book that you're gifting others? What book would you gift your team? This book is twice the amount of any other response. It's double. It is the most voted book for recommended reading for design leaders across the world. If you need something added to your reading list, I highly encourage you to check out Radical Candor. Yes, thank you, Marie, in the chat. I appreciate that for dropping it. Okay, tip number 5, team rituals and traditions. This one's going to go quick. Building traditions and rituals really it doesn't need a step-by-step guide, and you don't need one either. Yours can be something small and simple, like a weekly stand-up that starts with a simple round-robin question, checking in on the humans that you work with, like, how are you doing? Before you actually dive into the work itself. The key here is that rituals, regardless of what they look like, they need to focus on the person, on the human on the squad, the person behind the function, not just the designer, but who that person is. So I'm talking about real and organic opportunities to bond with team members. The specific actions of the ritual itself, full disclosure, they don't really matter. The thing that's really important here is that you are investing in activities that bring the team together. The other important part about this, I talked a lot earlier about things that might be really heavy to do, organizational endeavors, investing, like inspiring up. This is a bite-sized thing that you can do as a product manager, is just carve out time and build rituals. Perhaps it might be the best use of your time, in addition to the idea of instilling candor into your team's fabric, is creating rituals, because this will end up actually creating connective tissue with the designers, with the engineers, regardless of where they sit in the organization. And that's what all this is about, right? It's all about trying to create a better space where you can collaborate. And collaboration doesn't just happen. It happens based on trust. And trust only happens with time together, right? Create spaces where you can do rituals. Now, I'm going to ask for anybody on Twitter, tweet me really quick. I'm really curious, like, if you have rituals, what are your favorite ones, or which ones have you heard about? Here's my Twitter handle, and I would use the hashtag squad rituals. I'm going to tell you probably one of my favorite rituals that I've heard over the years is this idea of 5x5 storytelling. Now, this idea comes from San Francisco based digital agency RGA, and they have this awesome tradition called 5x5s. On the 5th day of every month at 5 p.m., 5 team members, they stand up in the rest of to the rest of the department. Now they get together on Zoom, and they share a turning point of something that happened in their lives for 5 minutes. The talks rarely have anything to do with work, but they're built to bring the team together. And the quote that I have to read, because it's so powerful, this is from one of the executive creative directors there. He said, these nights accelerate the notion of bringing your authentic self to the office, because they move us from just being a random group of people who work together to becoming members of the team. Of course, it has nothing to do with design. It means for you, it has nothing to do with the craft, but it has everything to do with the culture, which is, again, one of the best ways that you can spend your time as a product manager and an overall servant leader. So please let me know what your favorite rituals are. I'd love to hear what you're doing. And I have one more question for you, which is, I mentioned stand-ups earlier. Do you have a stand-up, and what does it look like? I'd love to hear what you do. And again, you can find me on Twitter right here and use the hashtag squad standups. Now, my stand-ups that I borrowed from a colleague that I absolutely love, we've really made it our own, is we will meet for 15 minutes every day. And the time is important. I would encourage you not to spend more than 15 minutes here, because it's, data has proven that we enter the land of endless meetings if we want to. If you set 30 minutes, if you set an hour, if you set 2 hours, your team will probably maximize that time. So time box it. Make the stand up 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes if you have a large enough team, and ask this open-ended question. Not everybody has to answer. Has anyone heard anything interesting? What's the water cooler moment, which becomes even more important in a remote environment, right? What did you all hear this week that we should all know about? And do you need help with anything? And then we do a very quick rapid fire around the group. What's everybody working on? Just bullet points. Quick, 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 quick. That way the entire team has context as to what their peers are working on. And you have less of the operator lost in translation effect that ends up happening. So that's the 5 tips. As far as where can you go to learn more resources, I like to think that every single company has these 3 lenses of business. You, whether you know it or not, you are putting these values out to your customers of practices, of people, and of platforms. Most of us really focus on platforms, but I wanted to share resources in all 3 of these areas for you today. Under the people bucket, I mentioned earlier that I oversee this community called the Design Leadership Forum. It's at designleadership.com. If you identify yourself as a design leader, meaning like you're at a director level or above, or you're in a product leadership role and you're overseeing the design function, and you'd like to go deeper and talk to your peers in a really safe space about what those shared challenges are and just get an inside perspective of how your peers are talking about these problems, check it out. It's at designleadership.com. I'm the curator of it. So you can also just find me anywhere on LinkedIn or social and just ask me questions. But we meet often and we ask these questions. Or we have discussions about shared challenges, and then we air those out and we learn together. Now, this is a private community. I will say that this isn't open to everybody. We really focus on creating a relevant space. And so please don't get offended if you nominate yourself and don't get accepted. This is really built for people managers first and foremost. But if you do fit that criteria, we'd love to have you and we'd love to talk to you. Next up, under the practices bucket, I mentioned a bunch of things. I'm just going to focus on the stuff that Envision has put out. Go back and check out the slide deck at the footers if you wanted the other resources, but I would encourage you to check out designbetter.co. This is a place of immense value, lots of free books, but don't take that to mean cheap. We have invested a lot of time and energy into understanding what the best practices are in product design, and we publish on these often. One book in particular that I'd like to focus everybody on is this new book that we just published called Remote Work for Design Teams. Most of us are operating in a remote environment, and this can help. I'd also check out the New Design Frontier, which is that report that I referenced a lot. And lastly, our platforms. Envision is a space, after all, where digital collaboration happens. We can be the ecosystem for end-to-end product building. So I would encourage you to check us out. I'll go ahead and drop links in a second. I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to really quickly get to the end here and just say thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your engagement. Looks like the chat was nuts. Hit me with your questions.
That was certainly over a few minutes, but absolutely worth it. Thanks a lot, Adam. This was, feels like around the world in 30 minutes. We went from every aspect of design to the squad, to the value, to the interlock, to a lot of actionable insights. So truly appreciate. There's a feedback poll that's come on this. That's going to come up on the screen. So feel free to give some feedback on how we make these sessions even better for the community. While the feedback poll is up, there was actually about 8 or 9 large themes that have emerged. In interest of time, we'll try to post them on LinkedIn, Adam, and if you can kind of answer them on the LinkedIn thread, that'll be great. But there's this one question that kind of was very popular in the questions that we saw, and this was the whole B2B versus B2C. How much of that squad, how much of the quantification, the value that you mentioned, Natrajan asked about curiosity, Shilpa asked about the whole concept of hardware versus software, but if you can focus on the B2B versus B2C in a quick response, what do you think would be different in your opinion?
Yeah. So let me play back the question. Is the core of the question, what's the difference between a squad who operates in a B2B or versus B2C?
That's right.
Okay. My take is that think about what a squad's supposed to do. right? Everything is supposed to be building experiences or outcomes for people mostly, and in some cases systems, but really that all ends up trickling down to people. I would say that there's not much difference. Everything has to do with completely being dedicated to customer driven outcomes. So while the squad might look differently or have totally different outputs, so the general practices at a fairly mid altitude should be the same, right? The squad still needs to be prioritizing things like how they communicate, how they end up doing handoff, the overall maturity of their collective practices. All that stuff matters, and that's going to be transferable from B2C to B2B to B2C. Now, I will say that some squads, they're in a little bit more of a difficult position, especially those in B2C environments right now, where, like I mentioned earlier, we're in a new age, and there are entire businesses, entire teams that, my heart goes out to you if you've been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. But really, the thing that we learned is that the roadmap issue was a big problem this year. And because of that, people couldn't change fast enough. So I would,
Yeah.
again, take all these tips and say, if you can subscribe to these, you actually end up putting the entire squad in a better position, not only to be able to survive in moments like this, where everything's changed underneath your feet, but maybe even thrive in it, because customer behaviors have changed. But if you have really strong, dedicated research muscles, you can adjust with your customers in live time, or at least with
Absolutely.
very little latency.
And I really like the notion of stakeholder management. I think the actionable tips that you gave there as well, I think it's also very important to make sure it's not the squad, but the layers up and the layers below are in line and in sync with as well, right? Well, super. That's just about all the time. Unfortunately, we had, I'm sure we're going to have Adam again for a more deeper conversation at some point in the festival. But truly appreciate Adam. Here's a little, speaking about remote and virtual. Here's our little virtual thank you badge for you. And I truly appreciate your time and effort, Adam. Thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all having me. Have a good festival.
Absolutely. Great. Our next speaker, is already here, but I'm going to turn it back over to Menka for some quick announcements, and kind of will kind of run right into the next session without taking a break.
So please, I hope you enjoyed the session. Please make sure to send us your testimonials. We won't take too much of time. We will go right into the session. And again, here's today's agenda. After Param, we have one more speaker, so please stay with us. And again, the open conference day, please go ahead and vote for your favorite topics, and same for the leadership board. Refer your colleagues and your friends and climb up the leadership board, and you will get a one-on-one mentoring session with our speakers. And so we have Param with us, and Param's question, we have a specific LinkedIn thread for Param's question. So please use this LinkedIn thread to post your questions. And Professor Shah, I hand this session over to you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Param, we kind of ran a little longer in our first session, but the good news is they're all warmed up for you. If you want to turn your mic on and just say a quick hello so we know that we can hear you.
Hi, Pinkesh, can you hear me?
Super, loud and clear.
Awesome.
Well, the second session is going to be a super layer on top of an already existing, exciting first one that we've had. Param is a chief design officer and leads the behavioral science and design function at Fractal. Fractal is a very large, very well-known, repute AI company, and kind of design in AI. We thought this would be a fantastic opportunity to also bring this aspect. On one hand, we're kind of getting more advanced with our AI and machine learning. On the other hand, how do we simplify the so-called complex? And so Param, with his 23 years of experience, has worked in design and innovation roles across companies like IDEO, Dr. Reddy's, GE Healthcare, across the industry, across the spectrum, if you will. In fact, a lot of work that Param has done has not only inspired hundreds and thousands of people, but there's actually a featured case study, for some of the work led by Param and IDEO. So in some sense, we are talking to a true celebrity. and I'm glad you could make it. But one of the things that was fascinating when I first met him was this notion, and in fact, his passion about mindfulness and art of stillness. I'm sure he's going to talk a little bit about that as well. But without further ado, Param, all yours.
Thank you, Pinkesh. Very honored and humbled to be listening to such a generous introduction. Thank you so much. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Loud and clear.
Okay, this is the first time I'm doing one of these online things, talking to 408 people.
Yeah, welcome to the new normal.
Yes, there's always a first time. So let me try and share my screen and get started. Just hang on. All right, let's see if this works.
Looks like we're having some difficulty with Param signing in. Why don't we, in the process, put up the poll that we wanted to put? If the team could put up poll number 2 on the screen, so we now know not only who is in the audience, but the kind of level of experience that we have in the crowd here today. Can we have poll number 2, team? Super, thank you. While we were waiting for you, Param, we thought we'll put up a poll and kind of get to know the audience a little bit as well. It'll hopefully help you, fine tune this on the fly.
I don't know what I did, but I managed to evict myself out. Sorry. Hold on. All right. Just let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep, we can.
Awesome. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining this session, and lovely to have a bunch of people from all over the world, I presume, joining in for this session. So I was invited by Pinkesh to talk about designing for the invisible and designing for AI, and I thought that was an intriguing topic and certainly super interesting. As a conversation to think about, what does the world of AI and what is the world of design when they come together? What does that look like, and how does that change how we think about solving for some of these new challenges? So in the next few minutes, I'm going to be sharing some thoughts and principles and some broad ways of thinking about what are the ways in which we can think about designing for AI in a better way. And then, of course, happy to take any questions and keep it as conversational as possible. So when I got this topic, I was intrigued by this idea of what is invisible, right? And asked myself this question: what does invisible look like? No pun intended. And as I started unpacking it, there were different dimensions of it. One is, of course, invisible means hidden. And if you think about this in the context of AI, there are so many products that we are now using in our daily lives where the AI, so-called, is hidden and is pretty much invisible because it's so there. It's so layered below what we use that we can't see it or know that there is AI behind it. Most people who use it probably don't even know that it has AI in it. So that's one sort of manifestation or example of that. The other is this voice assistant for doctors, a company called Suki. And this is an example of how the the physical world, where a doctor would have been entering some records onto a laptop or a desktop in the old world, is now entering that same patient information using a voice-enabled smartphone or whatever, voice-enabled app on a smartphone. And so that's intangible, right? And that's another example of something moving to invisible. Uh, you know, the third one is when some of the interactions that we have with the devices or the software that we are using become omnipresent and so well integrated into our daily lives. This is an example of the Apple CarPlay. And so it becomes so omnipresent and integrated that is also something that one can imagine as being invisible. Um, and so I think we all fairly very clearly know and understand that AI is driving a fundamental shift in our world in many ways, and it's still unfolding as we speak, and there's only more to come. But there are a few that I'm going to talk about, and then exemplify many of these as we go further. For example, the notion of active to passive. There are a lot of things that we used to do actively in the pre-AI world, and now it's becoming easier to do many of those passively because AI is simplifying that and making it change the way we interact with devices. Similarly, a lot of things we used to do manually are moving to automated sort of scenarios, either fully automated or partially automated. There are also examples where we used to do a lot of mundane things, whether it's filing expenses, by submitting some bills and papers or whatever, and much of that can be easily automated through some of these algorithms, and so in some ways this almost feels like magic, right? When a lot of these mundane things become so simplified. Um, I mean, those are just a few, and I'm going to talk many more about many more of such shifts. But really, I think I wanted to first talk about the fact that what are we actually designing for, right? And I think all of us would agree that whether there is AI or not, and even if there is AI, ultimately we are designing for people. And when you talk about designing for people, what we're really talking about is designing for emotions. And the reason I say that is several years ago, a person by name Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for his work in pioneering behavioral economics. And so a lot of this work and many other sort of experts have come up, have sort of talked about this idea that human decisions are fundamentally completely emotion driven, and they're not rational the way we think that we are rational people, right? We tend to rationalize a lot of our decisions post facto, and so there is that aspect of explaining what we do after we've done what we've done. But that explanation is a lot of rationalization. It's not really how we arrived at that decision, or why we took that decision. And so a lot of these emotions are actually driving how we think, how we feel, how we behave, how we what actions we take, and what decisions we make in our daily lives. And so I think I'd like to think of using this lens as we think about how can we design for better AI. And so that's the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about, with several examples, and and of course a question and answer in the end. So that's really the theme, which is designing for AI, and designing for AI for with designing AI for and with emotions, right? That's really what I'm going to be talking about. So let's start with a few examples, and talk about some of these facets, right? So this is an example of how what we used to do with in the mechanical or the sort of the manual way earlier with the vacuum cleaner, or of course even before vacuum cleaners, we would probably be using a regular sort of a mopper or whatever, and that has now shifted from a manual intervention to a fully automated intervention, where there are these robots or vacuum robots that go around the house and clean the floor. And so when you think about this kind of a situation, when you're moving from a manual to a fully automated, and of course fully, there is a spectrum even within that concept of fully automated. It's not necessarily 100% automated, but in that situation, what are the things that we should be thinking about, right? So these are a bunch of questions that you'll see now with every example that I talk about, which is, in this case, for example, what will reinforce control, feedback, and a sense of accomplishment? And why I say that is because when you're using a vacuum cleaner, the physical way, the mechanical way, the earlier, you would use it with your hands and you would move it around. You would get that instant sense of control. You would get that instant feedback. Is it working? Is it not working? You can actually see the whatever it is that you're cleaning on the floors, it's getting better or whatever, right? And that sense of feedback gives you that control, and vice versa. So how does that sense of control and feedback become clear, become present in a situation where it's an automated robot? What about a sense of accomplishment, right? When work hard, sweeping your house with a vacuum cleaner for several minutes or hours, at the end of it, you feel a sense of accomplishment. Now, how does that change when you are using a robot, right? Of course, one can interpret it as there is no need for a sense of accomplishment because now the robot is doing its job and you are free to do something else. Or is there a way that you can build in a feature of some kind of an accomplishment or a sense of accomplishment or progress in this device in an automated situation, right? So, for example, some of the ways to deal with it could be visibility, customization, override. So, visibility, for example, when the machine is going all around the house, is there a certain visibility that the user would get on their mobile or on their other devices, which gives you a sense that yes, this is what's going on in the house, or this is how the work is happening. Is there a sense of customization? Can I say that, hey, don't go to this room today, or just focus on this part of the house? Is there a sense of override? Can I quickly override when there is something that goes wrong? So these are the ways in which we can deal with some of the emotional needs that drive this context. Pinkesh, I don't know how this works, but I'm assuming the questions would follow in the end. I should just
They are pouring in already, Prameshwar, and so we'll let you kind of come to a natural halt or a conclusion, then we'll kind of pour the questions to you in as much as we can in the time frame that we have.
Okay, great, sure. The second one is this example of this whole transformation that's happened in banking over the last several years. And this is one particular one from China where there is so much data that Jack Ma's company has been collecting of consumers over time. And now you can actually run so much analysis using all of those different data points across longitudinal sort of data, and make very, very instant recommendations or decisions about whether to lend some money to someone or not. Now, from a user standpoint, when you think about it, I think one is, of course, it moves from being a laborious process to a magical process. That's one shift that's happening. But from a user standpoint, what drives trust and engagement, right? So, I would imagine that some technologies like these would get commoditized very soon, if not already become commoditized. And so, what would differentiate me going to this bank versus some other bank? And therefore, why how would I as a banking company create that trust and engagement? And that's something that would be important to think about. And I think the way to think about that from to address those emotional needs would be explainability. For example, if I'm entering in using this app, and if I'm applying for a loan, can I get a better understanding of what kind of data has been captured about me based on which those decisions are being made? Or can I get a sense of what were the criteria used for saying yes or no to me for that loan, right? Can there be more transparency in the way that loan is being offered to me, and so on? So those are the ways in which that I as a user would feel, yes, this is something that not just makes it convenient for me, but also builds trust and engagement for a more longer term perspective. The third example is this Kickstarter project that I came across recently, a while back actually. It's called Arsenal. I don't know if they've gone sort of production yet, but I thought the concept was quite cool, and I do a fair bit of photography myself, so I could relate with it. It basically is sort of an assistant for photographers, which can allow you to sort of determine the most optimal setting for shooting a scene because it has been able to analyze thousands and thousands of images over time, and it has learned about what works and what doesn't. And if you think about this from different points of view, the question that I'm asking here is, what do people value the most, right? And what I mean by that is, if you talk about a professional photographer who uses cameras like these, which are fairly complex and very, very advanced, or to a novice or an amateur photographer who's using an SLR, but doesn't have the pedigree or the sort of the control of the camera like the professional photographer, how it would play out for both of these people using this device would be very interesting, right? So for the professional photographer, what he or she might look for is a sense of control and freedom, and maybe deburdening from the laborious process of doing the post-production on the photographs that he or she has shot, which is may run into thousands of photographs, right? That's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is that it can actually rob them of that sense of control and freedom, because for a lot of professional photographers or serious hobbyists, using a camera like this is actually about giving them that sense of control, and therefore is this taking that away from them? So how do they feel about it, and therefore how are we giving that sense of control? How are we calibrating that sense of control for different types of people, right? And so while we've gone from a technique situation to a creativity situation, are we thinking about that differently for different types of users? So this is I thought, an interesting scenario. Building off of that, again, a camera sort of use case, again, sort of I think a fairly startup or a Kickstarter kind of project. But this is a clip that you can wear, and apparently it would sort of life log, as they call it, capture all the stuff that's happening through your day on video, and it would sort of analyze and pick a certain parts of the days, and sort of put a video together, which you can post on your social media or whatever. And so again, the question is, what do people value the most in this context from an emotional standpoint, right? And what drives that usage? And so here the notion is moving from constraints, which is that, oh, I have to carry a big camera and I have to, lug it around, and I have to be in everyone's face shooting all the time. And I don't know what parts of my day might be interesting or what might be boring. And moving to a situation where it's freeing you up from all of those decisions, and the algorithm or the AI's sort of system is being able to make those decisions for you, and learns through the process, right? So very, very interesting, different dynamic. So though the emotions are going to be a lot about the fear of missing out, what might be the moment that are worth capturing, and of course some of the bragging rights that come along, and those are things that that people will think about. This is an interesting one. Recently, I think it hasn't gone live yet, but I think they showcased it at CES last year, I believe. This is something that L'Oreal has put together. Let me play a quick video of this, and I'll come back to the question. But the question is, what emotional payoffs drive daily use versus special occasion use, right? Now, depending on the context of the product or service that you're making, is it a one-time use? Is it a daily use? Is it a special occasion use? Each of those moments will have different level of different types of emotional payoffs, and therefore how do you think about designing for each of those contexts differently? So I'm going to play this video. Hopefully it's going to play all right and you can hear and see it. In case, just let me know if you can.
Are you getting the most out of your beauty routine? Introducing Perso by L'Oreal, a 3-in-1 device for personalized beauty. Powered by artificial intelligence, Perso creates skincare, liquid lipstick, and foundation just for you, on demand. Plus, it gets smarter over time. How does it work? In the app, Perso leverages L'Oreal's Modiface technology to evaluate your skin. Then it assesses important environmental factors like pollution, air quality, and humidity. Perso even considers your top skincare concerns and priorities. Next, it engages its patented 3-cartridge system, using advanced robotics to dispense the perfect formula for you. Perso can even create personalized foundation using its precise shade finder tool. Want to create a signature lip? Perso can do that too. Or try color matching. Coordinate your lip with your dress, shoes, or the latest trends. So next time you're staring into your cabinet, ask yourself, could your beauty routine be working smarter for you? Now, there's an intelligent beauty device with L'Oreal's unparalleled expertise. Perso by L'Oreal. Personalized beauty comes home.
Pinkesh, were you able to hear that?
Absolutely. Lot of people are searching on Google how to find it now.
Okay, great. Hopefully there are a lot of women on this call, so yeah, I'd love to hear their feedback. But so I think the question that I was asking about this was, again, think of this as a kind of a cool gadget that you would buy. Of course, a lot of money you spend on, and then is it a special occasion use, or is it a daily use product? And therefore, how would the context change the way you think about it, the emotional payoffs that would that the user would sort of look for or get, right? So can we, how does the context shift from an everyday mundane to a daily delight, right? So and therefore, how do we think about those payoffs? this is the next one, which is again, I'm always amused about how so many of these robot type cute looking gadgets and devices have come out, especially on Kickstarter. Many of them have not made it into reality, but I found one more of these. I don't know again if it's in production, but what I like about the concept here is the idea that that the device or the voice assistant or the robot is not answering but is also asking you questions, or is engaging with you proactively, right? So I thought this was interesting, which is that what drives credibility, what drives the notion of something being intelligent. Is it just answering questions, or is it also provoking curiosity and coming forth with certain points of view or questions, right? And that I thought was an interesting way of building emotional connections. The sense of humor, curiosity, quirkiness, these are all attributes that make people feel that this is not just a device or a piece of technology, but something that more that you can build an emotional connection with. And again, I mean, the technologies are still evolving, and a long way to go before it can get to the level of ease of fluidity or conversation with human beings. But I think it is getting there in some contexts. This is an interesting one, which is quite thought-provoking. Some might even think, out there as an example. But this is a company called Hereafter, and they basically record conversations with folks, who want to, leave their voice, so-called, or their memories to people who they leave behind after they die. And so it's a think of a scenario where if I'm feeling down and if I want to talk to my loved one who passed away, I just like I talk to Siri or Alexa, I would say, hey, Alexa, I'm feeling down today. And so this person who has passed away and has recorded those voices, all those memories are the right memories are sort of put together, and conversations are sort of stitched together and brought up in context with that prompt. And so this person replies back saying, hey, I know how you feel on a bad day and blah blah. All of it is recorded, but it's being, so it's moving more from just archiving, which is just record, just a sort of, a sort of a unintelligent way of recording what happened. But that's more of just archiving. But it's moving to remembrance, which is in context, pulling out things which make sense and stitching it together. So I think the question here would be what would drive an authentic experience, because this context is extremely sensitive. It would require a huge amount of honesty and contextuality to the question being asked, or the prompt being given. So, how do you move from it being just a gimmicky experience to being an authentic experience? And for that, a lot of those emotional needs would have to be focused on. The next one is again, I don't know if this is in the real world yet, but a selfie type keyboard apparently, and so it's a virtual keyboard. And I thought this idea of the physical keyboard disappearing and you having to just sort of gesture and type was interesting. But it also reminded me of the Google Glass when it first came out, and a lot of the backlash that happened initially because it just felt weird wearing these geeky looking glasses, and people felt sort of alienated, or the social norms didn't sort of allow for that technology to take off at that point, right? And of course the Google Glass has come back in a different avatar now, and they've focused the context much more for a business to business sort of situations with manufacturing plants and other sort of areas where glass like that would make sense. But that's why the question is what norms define acceptability, and what would allow you to blend in or stand out depends on what the user cares about in that context, right? So while it can be moving from inconvenience to simplification, it's important to consider these social norms and think about the relevance. The next one, which is of course a big rage now, TikTok. What is interesting about this is that a lot of the success that TikTok has had, while of course there are these two extremes from what I've heard. I'm not a hardcore, or I'm not a user of TikTok either, but I believe what there is the two extremes where you can just engage in a completely passive way, and the algorithm sort of throws up content to you which is super relevant, and of course it keeps you addicted because it's just scrolling content. You don't even need to scroll, it just keeps hitting you. but it knows you so well that it gives you those recommendations in an intelligent way. The other is, of course, the creation part. It moves you from pure engagement to creation, because the act of creation is now simplified so much that you can, which is what I've written, which is projecting one's superpowers. What I mean by that is you now suddenly become empowered to create very advanced looking, content or videos, or with cool effects and special effects and whatnot, and create all sorts of personas and fun stuff. And that suddenly, that's a superpower for people, who probably are very, very technology illiterate, or even actually completely illiterate. So and so that's a powerful sort of shift. And therefore, again, what's the emotional payoffs that drive people to go from engagement to creation? And so, how is the technology enabling that? I think this is this last, or the second last one, which is, what are the mental models that drive interaction with the device, right? So if you look at this device, which is some kind of a assistant in an airport in Japan, I believe. And so many of these kind of machines are going to start getting used in public environments. And so, what are the different people's mental models of a device or a gadget like this, right? For a senior citizen, for example, is the mental model of authority, right? Would let's say my dad, if you were to come in contact with a device like this, he would be mortified by it. If he would interact with it, he would probably interact with it like the way he's talking to a cop or someone else in authority. Whereas if a young person interacts with this device, it might be more of a guide or a buddy. And so what mental model would sort of make that interaction change is something that is worth thinking about. I think this is the last one. And again, the same example that I talked about earlier about Suki, which is a voice assistant for doctors. A lot of the examples that I shared earlier before this, are fun and, more on the sort of entertainment and sort of social side. This one is an example, just like autonomous cars or any of these other situations. This is a context where, serious decisions are being made. There's a lot of lives at stake, literally. And so any mistakes, so-called, either real or perceived by the user, would have large consequences. And therefore, when a user is using a product like this, and this is just, I've taken Suki as a random example, but I'm sure the product is great. But if there were some kind of an error in the way that the doctor experienced the product the first time, or first few times he or she used it, what are the consequences of those ineffective interactions, right? Would the user feel that sense of loss of control or insecurity, and therefore would it result in skepticism? And therefore, when you're dealing with a lot of these applications, which are not fun, but really more of accountability focused context, then what are the ways in which we need to think about designing for those emotions, right? So this is worth thinking about in many of these new applications for AI. So in summary, I think these were all the questions that came up in these examples. But as you can see, these questions can be taken to any example of or any other context of AI being used, and would be mostly fairly relevant and worth thinking about as we think about solving for these contexts. With that, I will say thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know if I went over time or under, or
no, perfectly fine. This was amazing. I think the journey of your real world examples and case studies, I think, certainly makes it a lot more lively and contextual. In fact, it's funny you mentioned Suki. We had Puneet Singh, who is the co-founder and CEO of Suki, who was actually on the festival in the data science edition 2.5 weeks ago. In fact, you brought up another important point around emotions, especially trust. How do you design for trust? And we have a very interesting topic that I think Saptarshi from Swiggy is going to talk on June 23rd, just on that topic on, how do you design for building trust, especially now in the post-COVID world. And obviously companies like Swiggy are going to be seen with a certain skeptical lens. Do I order food, and do I know what's happening in the kitchen? Do I know what's happening with the delivery boy? But I think coming back to a few questions that have kind of bubbled up here, Smita had a good question. I think a couple other people chimed in. If you look at the layers of design, right from perhaps kind of the tenets of emotional design to interaction design to UX design to visual design, do you think that designing for AI is going to perhaps de-emphasize and potentially even eliminate this need for visual design, right? What's your guidance for designers, and how do you see this panning out in the next few years? Where a lot of focus today, a lot of buzz at least, if not focus, has been around visual design. Do you see that going away?
So I think, look, I mean, if I see the evolution of the world, of the design world in the last, especially 10 years, but I would say it's been happening gradually even before. Uh, I don't think, anyone who's thinking about design in a pure visual design sense anymore is probably not, thinking rightly about design. As I see it, design is today really looked at as a way of problem solving, as a way of understanding. It's not about making some, making a product or a service and then thinking about how do you package it in a sexy way or in a cool way after the fact. It is more about what should we be fundamentally making that would be delightful to people, right? And that they care about, and then going about making that product, and then the so-called usage or selling of it would automatically happen, right? So that's the paradigm shift that's happened in the design world, I think, in the last decade or two. And so I think for me, the notion of visual design is important, of course, because it is an important attribute of design, but it's only the skin. And I like to give this analogy of cooking, right? I mean, it's like a good chef would spend a lot of time in a lot of things that happen before the final presentation, right? The final presentation of the plate is the last step. There's a hell of a lot of stuff that a good chef would do before that steps, including finding the right ingredients, designing the right recipe, of course, making the recipe based on her experience over time or his experience over time, finding the right ingredients, sourcing them, checking the quality of them, cooking it, of course, in the right way with whatever secret sauce that they have, and then all of the preparation and all of that, and then you get the dish, and then it's presented in a beautiful way. So presentation matters, but it's the last step. If that's what you're focusing on or starting with, then that's you're not gonna get good design, or for that matter, a good product. That's what I believe.
Good point. I want to ask a question that I think has been posed by Amya Rai, experienced designer at IBM. I think Raminder Kaur had a similar question, who's a senior product manager at the Indian Express. Do you design around the technology once the technology is built, or do you lead the engineers with design? Do you design first based on the context of the user and then tell the technology guys to go build? Because in the context of AI, it's kind of slightly different. With a lot of these examples that you've mentioned, I'm sure no customer really asked for one or could visualize one.
Yeah.
And so in your world, as you design for the invisible, and as you design for AI, who leads this charter?
Look, I think the notion that it's an either or. I don't think that paradigm exists anymore. I think we live in a world where we have to think about and it's about the designer being respectful and appreciative of the technology, as much as the technology has to be respectful and appreciative of design. And it's important, especially when it comes to disruptive and emerging technologies, right? When it's a disruptive technology or a new technology which doesn't exist today or is not mainstream, people will not understand or appreciate what that technology can do for them in a true sense, right? And therefore, yes, you can't go and ask. You should not, by the way, ever go and ask someone, "What do you want?" First of all, that's the wrong question to ask, right? I mean, a lot of people talk about this famous adage about, if Henry Ford had gone and asked, what people want, they would have said they want faster horses. I think that adage is not, it's incorrect, because it's a fundamentally bad question to ask. First of all, if you go and ask someone, what do you want? You should never ask that question. So understanding people and understanding their emotions doesn't mean that you have to go and ask people what they want. So there are methods and ways in which one goes about understanding needs. That's a whole session by itself. I'm not going to go into that now, but the point is, I think it's a collaborative effort, and I think designers need to explore and look at what technology makes possible, prototype and put those prototypes in front of users and learn from that experience, because only when people experience something can they actually sense or get a feeling of whether something makes sense for them or not. And more often than not, when someone experiences something new for the first time, more often than not, they would probably say, oh no, I'm not going to use this, or they might say, yes, this looks great, but if you ask them to pay money for it, they'll probably say no. But that doesn't mean that the
Absolutely.
product doesn't work. It just, you need a more nuanced way of understanding actually what needs work and what don't. So
Empathy is king. Absolutely. I want to, we're running out of time. Our next fantastic speaker is also waiting. But I want to, acknowledge at least the quick questions that have come in from Rishabh, at Bosch, Digvijay. We have Syed, who had a good question, Anuradha, Subramaniam Ganeshan. There's one last question to kind of end this with from Smriti and a couple others as well. How much business, and a follow-up question, how much technology should a designer know in the new world?
well, I think the general principle for everyone going forward is that everyone needs to be technologically savvy, and not just savvy, but fairly hands-on, right? I mean, I think that ship has sailed. Every one of us needs to be able to play with technology to a degree that that makes sense for their job or whatever, right? And that bar is only going up year on year, right? I mean, so in a few years from now, probably everyone will have to code, or that might be the expectation, right? I mean, and maybe coding will also become easier, right? Maybe people like me who have no idea how to code will learn and will be able to code because that's how easy it might become. So I think all of these notions are shifting a lot, and I think also the idea of disciplines are merging now, right? I mean, it's no longer
Cross-functional, yeah.
exactly. So things are going to happen at the intersection of disciplines. So I think that's the other thing which will also make people become a lot more technologically dependent.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we had, but keep your questions coming on the specific LinkedIn thread that has been created. Can we have the poll, the feedback poll on the screen? And, certainly would like to get some feedback so we know what to do next. How do we do it better? But hey, this was absolutely amazing, Param. Thanks for doing this. I know there's a lot going on right now, personally and professionally with you, but I truly appreciate you spending the time with the community and sharing your wisdom. Here's a little virtual badge for you. Do scan the QR code. There's some AI magic that will happen as well. But truly appreciate you doing this for the community. So
Thank you.
a big thanks.
Thank you so much, Pinkesh and Menaka, and everyone. Thanks so much for logging in. Bye-bye. Good night.
Super. Excellent. Over to you, Menka.
Thank you, Pinkesh. Thank you, Param. So we had a wonderful session by Adam and Param, and it's time for us to start our next wonderful session by Payal Arora. So before we get on to the session, please, again, I request you to ask your questions. So each LinkedIn thread are unique. They are created for each one of the sessions. So please scan this QR code and post your questions on the LinkedIn thread. And allow me to welcome Prashant Poladia. He's going to be the moderator for the session, this session. So Prashant is Senior Product Manager, UX and Data Evangelist with SmartTech 21. Prashant, welcome, and over to you. You're on mute, Prashant.
Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Minka. So do we need to give any pseudo break? I know a lot of participants, more than 360. I see earlier more than 400 as well. Now I see around 360 plus participants, and do we straight straight jump to the sessions, or do we wait for some sort of break? Okay, I assume that we just continue. So good to hear that. What I'll do is quickly I'll introduce Payal, as we are already very close to the timing, and then luckily we sort of just 10 minutes away from the usual time. So here with us we have a Payal Arora, and she is a digital anthropologist and the author of award-winning books, including the recent The Next Billion Users and a TEDx speaker. Her expertise lies in digital experiences and user values among low-income communities worldwide, and comes with more than a decade of fieldwork experience in such context. She was also Forbes named her as a next billion champion, and she is a kind of right person for a reform of tech. So probably, as you already just got introduction, so if you need any guidance or a coaching to disrupt any of the tech, to whom you should reach out to. At the same time, she is celebrity among several international media like BBC, Economics, etc. She is also a travel addict, having a good, and she has given a lot of presentations, almost 200 plus presentations in 109 cities and 54 countries. This is fascinating. And I'm lucky to have you, Payal. It's all yours.
Thank you, Prashant, and appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Let me just share the screen. All right, let's see. I don't think I can now tap.
You can sharing this file. Yes.
Sorry?
You can start sharing your screen and this will go up.
Okay, all right, okay. Sorry. All right. Yeah, thanks everyone. So this is really wonderful to be here. I know it's really late out there, so I'm going to try to wake you up. So, I was listening to the previous presentation, and I really think this is wonderful because I really resonate with a number of points from the previous presentation. So let me just get started, and you'll see the ties here, right? So indeed, I authored this book, The Next Billion Users, last year, and I am a digital anthropologist, and usually the next question is, what the hell is that, right? And so basically, that's just a fancy way of saying that I look at and study how people make sense of everyday digital media in their everyday lives, right? So what do they think about it? How do they use it? And for over a decade, I've spent the time in low-income communities, starting with India, actually, my first care was in Kuppam, and then after that was in Almora, so a number of parts in India, and then it scaled to Brazil, Nigeria, more recently, Rwanda is emerging. So, quite a diversity of sites, right? And particularly low-income populations. So what's really interesting, right, is since about a year, this book has sort of gained a lot of traction, and it's not a coincidence because I've been doing what I've been doing for more than a decade. So why now? Why is it this new hot thing about the next billion user market? You have even the term, the NBU market has become something of a thing, right? Google and Spotify, a number of these institutions and organizations have set up their own little NBU research wings. And what's fascinating in the last year alone, I've been talking to such a diversity of organizations. These are just a sample, like more than 40 to 50 from consulting to giving talks. And the common denominator here is the next billion user market. So if you look at Process, for example, they're one of the biggest technology investment companies. So they invest in emerging tech, right? And what's really interesting is they have changed their whole business model in terms of they're not just remote investors. They're very much hands-on. They want to be partaking in design. So, this is very much resonant from the prior presentation about this sort of blurring of professionalisms, right? That designers are in one box, technologists are in another box. Here you have investors who are saying, hang on, this is my business too. I have some ideas, right? So you have Prosus, you have Liberty Latin America Telecom, which has dominated the Latin American market for a long time, particularly the low-income segment. And they wake up with the unusual sort of case of, yes, they're cash heavy and they're pretty secure, but they seem to be doing some real cost-intensive investment in these societies. And the way they look at it is their pie is being stolen by all these apps that are feeding off all their heavy investment. And I can go into Spotify that has just set up their next billion user lab, and they're finding that it's not enough to just translate an app, into the indigenous language and then say, look, this is at last adopted to the local context, right? It just doesn't work in context, particularly as complex as India. And, something like solar, like the North Solar, where you have these new business models that are emerging, which are packaging the most interesting assortment of services. And you're going to see this much more so, right? Especially during the COVID times, because you need to do a lot of value addedness. So what is solar? North Solar is basically they're selling solar panels, but for them to get Rwanda's MOU through, they had to also package it with partnering with app developers and designers and all kinds of, they need to provide so much more as a package deal because they're dealing with a newbie public, which is new on many fronts, from fintech to solar panels. So how do you, sort of enculturate that kind of new user group, right? So indeed, these conversations are really fascinating, and but it helps for us to sort of anchor by asking us something really basic. Who are these next billion users, right? So just on a more basic level, they are, for a good part of them are young, something like 35% to 40%. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, it can go as high as 60% to 65%, right? So, and a majority of them live outside the West. So in fact, you even see the birth decline in places in Europe, and you see a huge uptake in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And you're talking about 85% of the population is residing, especially young people who are very much adept and are embracing mobile technologies, right? And there are far more male than female. In fact, a disturbing trend of women's adoption and sustenance on these apps are declining actually in the last year or so. And we can talk more about that later, right? So this is a sort of a demographic. Now, obviously, this is, this wake-up call is not a coincidence about the next billion users, because just by the sheer number, we're talking about they are disproportionately from the low-income segment, right? So by sheer number, they are just a data gold mine, right? That's such an obvious, so they are the new oil. And so of course, every company wants to really tap into that, right? So this is really what we're talking about as a sort of the fuel for the data economy. And if you look at it in terms of the AI economy, they're talking about how this is also really the way in which you can get a leg up in terms of AI growth, right? So very clearly, nobody's arguing that the NBU should be at the center of UX now. We need to start thinking about it. In fact, that's one of the most powerful ways of disrupting your business model. Because look, you need to think out of the box. And if this is an untapped market, then of course, on multiple fronts, you need to go for it, right? But the question is, there still remains a huge dearth of information. Like, we are really lacking. It's like a black hole of information of what's going on there. We don't know much about it. And the kind of information we already have is deeply colored by certain stereotypes, right? So I'd like to just talk about 3 myths, because look, we are in a very unusual time. We all know this. I mean, don't bring up the C word, right? It's like COVID is like pretty much infused our whole imagination. And it is tempting to become risk averse, because this whole let's go back to business as usual, let's go back to normal, right? There's this yearning for normalcy, and that's not going to work, as we know that, right? Because these are extremely disruptive forces at multiple ends, and it is a global phenomenon. So how do you assess risk? How do you take on risk? And so people are justifiably, could be arguing that, well, sure, the next billion user market would have been a great focus, last year or pre-COVID, but now things are different. We can't afford to experiment. And I'm arguing it's the reverse. Actually, you cannot afford not to experiment, because look, there's a huge rush towards the usual suspects. This is the untapped market. And if you really want to stay ahead in the game, especially in these times, you need to look at them as the core market and central to your redesign, right? And the other sort of aspect I would like to say to designers is that, you're not just designing a product, you're designing a social institution. Now, that is something I would like to really emphasize. You're building a political sphere, you're building an educational sphere, so like programmers can actually, it's like building up a school, like with a brick and mortar. Okay, how do you want this building to look like? But you're building the ethos of what education looks like, the underlying paradigm, right? The relationship between the teacher and the students and the administrators, that is encoded into design. And so you're literally building relationships and institutional buildings. So it is really a sort of it's an honor to be profiled in that position, and an enormous responsibility, which means to mitigate the risk, you need to first address the 3 myths, right? Just for the sake of, for this presentation, I've sort of like just plucked out 3 different myths that we tend to fall in love with or tend to hold on to a bit more than others. And the myth is that of the rational user, right? Now, in a decade of my research, I started off in Kupam, as you can see, with Hewlett Packard, and this small project where they were like, we're going to bring, information to the doorstep of all people. And this was years ago, right? And the idea, this was when Chandrababu Naidu was, the CEO of Andhra Pradesh, so quite a while ago. But the idea was it's going to become this community. We're going to have a NASDAQ information 24/7. People are just going to be completely transformed. And, one of the biggest the ways in which people got on board and got into the internet and got into computers was through entertainment. We would have movie vans, right, which would go into different villages. And that's why they came, not because of how farmers could be competitive with crop pricing, or women could learn about healthcare information. All that was fluff. They wanted to watch the good old Telugu movies, or kids wanted a game on this ATM of information. So it was fascinating. It was a hook, right? And I've been sort of harping on this about how we need to stop being so cautious and we need to talk about the leisure that people amongst low-income communities want to experience. And somehow people feel very uncomfortable about that, because they feel you can't be, we're talking about a serious subject. Poverty is serious business. You can't trivialize it with leisure. And in fact, if anything, if people are poor, of course, they're going to be much more rational about how they use their very limited data plans. And on the contrary, it's not the case, because in fact, it's an essential coping mechanism. And today we have the data to prove it. We know that majority of what people do are very leisure oriented, very social. A lot of the data is diverted towards even pornography, social networking sites, gaming sites, So it's really, of course, entertainment, right? I mean, Geo itself, look at their advertising byline, the ABCD principle, right? How do they sell it? Is because they understood, based on the data itself, that the average Indian user, particularly of the low income segment, needs 4 things. And that would be a big hook, right? ABCD, astronomy, Bollywood, cricket, and devotion, right? And that has been my data for more than a decade. So it's only now, if we had listened to the thick data from the field, we would have been on top of this, a decade earlier. Imagine that, right? So what I'm arguing here is we need to put the ludic, which is play, into the ludicrous design. It may seem unreasonable and ludicrous and irrational if we have a particular stereotype of vision of this user as very rational. But it would make complete sense if we understand that they're very human, and in a sense, it's an essential coping mechanism, and they need to be immersed in these kinds of platforms, right? So the second myth, right, is that they're a stable user. Now, the stable user is sort of a misnomer because, this is a sort of an import from, a typical stable incomes of, you have a monthly paycheck, for example. You live with a family in a family home. You actually have a home, you have an address, right? So these things are so obvious that you don't even think about it. So when Spotify is coming into India, right, they have a family plan as a way to sort of attract different family members, and a postpaid to, give it a sort of a recurrence, right? So this is very important. Now, of course, that doesn't make sense if you start to look at the realities on the ground level. Majority of the NBU segment live paycheck to paycheck on an everyday level, right? So they don't have a monthly income. They often don't have savings. They have payments. The payment options need to be made a day at a time. Secondly, their families don't look like a cliche family that we envision. In fact, mass migration, we're talking about millions, Filipinos, nurses moving to Canada, leaving their families behind, right, for the grandparents to take care. Bangladeshi construction workers moving to Dubai, millions of them, so they can send back home. In fact, the NBU economy is a remittances economy. And this is a kind of typical picture you can see about a family, which is 6 to 8 young men, whether it's in in a small town in China to Dubai, sharing a room, right? And that's their family for a year or so, or many more years, right? So that's something that we need to disrupt in terms of the stability of a user. So what I'm really asking here is that we need to think in terms of flexible design, right? Because you can't have a frozen design and then flirt around the edges of change. The design needs to be intrinsically flexible so you can create and add value and allow and co-create, right? Which means that you need to be able to work with the segment, because the fact is that you're not going to understand the segment, and you never will, because they're not a frozen entity, right? So they are going to change because their circumstances are going to change, their contexts are going to change. So we need to be able to allow them the engagement, as the prior speaker talked about, like become more of a producer, creator, but not just in terms of content, in terms of design, right? For them, for you and them to have a good dynamic. And so that actually is another way of reducing the risk when you're dealing with the NBU market. And the last myth is about this cultural user, right? And I hear this really often. It's our Indian culture, it's the Brazilian culture, it's an African culture. And I understand, we do understand why people like to state that, because you feel that you need to have a sense of belonging, because there's no such thing as an indiscriminate public, right? We don't just want to be anybody and belong to the world. We want to feel special. So we want to be part of a specific group of communities. But the choice should be from the user end, not from that imposed upon. And unfortunately, we are riding on certain cultural tropes, whether on a nationalistic end that, oh, Indians would behave this way. Now, if you look at the consumption of music, right, say Spotify or music in India, hip hop and K-pop is consumed by a lot of these people. I have a lot of low-income communities, especially even young girls and boys, able to lip sync on TikTok Justin Bieber, right? And so K-pop is actually a very dominant genre. This is completely not Indian, right? So it sort of defies that. But we are global aspirational beings. And that's very intrinsic of the NBO market, is they're even more aspirational and they want to be part of this global citizenship, right? And so another aspect of the cultural user is that, for example, there's a gendered aspect, because we feel that we've been fed into, fed with certain kind of cultural tropes of, well, the farming community, for example, there's a certain culture. It's obviously masculine, right? The typical farmer, you have a picture of a male, and farmer suicides and males being at a loss on how to provide for the family. Now, if you look at the stats, more than 70% of the agricultural community in many African countries are women dominated. Construction work in India is also a substantive number of them, are millions of them are women, right? So a lot, and farming communities, including the one I was a part of in Almora, completely dominated by women, more than 95%, because these are subsistence versus commercial farming. But we don't differentiate it. And why does that matter? Is because we need to understand that what we have today is, and what we need today in this rush towards automation and AI and optimizing the potential of AI, is that we need to think in terms of deep design, right? What does that mean? It means deep learning, which is machine thinking, where it depends on how you label data, and that kind of labeling will be reproduced based on typical state categories that we will be importing into the system. And design thinking, which basically says you can't just cater to one aspect. You need to see the ecosystem within which that entity is, right? So deep design is basically bringing the two together to make sense, so again you can reduce the risk. So for the sake of time, I would like to end with just in terms of leadership, right? We have these sort of cliches of don't be evil from Google. I would argue we need to talk about don't be good. And I know I'm kind of trolling here, but what I mean by this is that I am so sick and tired of hearing about AI for good initiatives. What does good mean? Because it's very dangerous when you look at tech companies telling and sort of convincing designers they're doing good by designing this app for empowerment, right? Because when you have this like AI for good mantra, then what happens is that you start to become condescending to your users. You start to keep thinking about it as an altruistic act. No, they are very much consumers. They're paying with their data, which you need, right? And platforms definitely need. And they're paying with their time, they're paying with their privacy, they're trading off a lot, right? So we cannot go into this AI for good down the line. Other is Facebook, right? Move fast and break things. We need to understand it's of course that has been critiqued a lot about its disruption, but we should replace it with move slow and build things, because the fact is when people said, oh my God, Facebook has betrayed us and betrayed our trust, we're going to leave it. Well, people didn't leave it, not because they love Facebook necessarily, but because it has become more than just an app. It's become a public sphere. And I said at the beginning, you're building institutions, particularly in majority of the global South countries, which have weaker institutions. And so people are seeking for alternative platforms which can allow for new kind of politics, a new kind of commerce. So you're building things, and start to think about why Libra failed, right? Because they didn't have a sort of a trust economy, and they moved too fast, right? With sheer hubris. And then Apple, right? About think different to, I would say, think difference, because we need to account that if we realize that 70% of the typical prototype user is traditionally white male, and if you look at different industries, not just like say tech, it's across different industries, particularly from the West, these ideas get imported and then you sort of tweak it, right? Whether it is testing driverless cars, look at the kind of dummies that are used, right? In terms of height, whether it's male or female, body type, etc. So the problem is it's not about diversity for diversity's sake, it's diversity because it makes the most sense. So I'm going to just stop here because I think it will be more interesting. I saw so many interesting questions from people. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can continue the conversation.
So it's a time where, Menka, you want to bring a specific that one of the poll on the screen so that we get the information that we are seeking for.
Sure, Prashant.
Sure. And wonderful pile so far in terms of what you shared, in terms of what are the different myths that you talked about. Wonderful in terms of even the different acronyms that you usually you shared about it: A, B, C, D, astronomy, Bollywood, cricket, and devotion. That's what Geo focused on. At the same time, you coined another one, NBU, a next billion user. So fascinating in terms of understanding, learning a lot of things from you. So one of the other interesting question that I see that the list is one of the, when you say design should be personalized, how can one design the same thing, that you design, which will usually work for the billions as well? How can you design that, that kind of solution which works for billions?
Well, I mean, that's actually an interesting point. So, people, this ties to why digital anthropology, right? Because I'm a big advocate for this, because the thick data, in some sense, the typical argument of, oh, a small study, which is data, deep,
Okay.
is not enough to give me the confidence as a decision maker, whether I'm a designer or not, to design in a particular way. I need the data, right? We know now that big data is deeply flawed because it has really, like whether it's Twitter data, right? It's barely representational of the general public. It's mainly white male of a high economic standpoint. So we already have a lot of the data of the gaps and also very misleading aspects of big data. However, we haven't focused on, it's not either or, as the prior presenter brought up, it's and, right? So it's thick data in conjunction with big data. And the interesting thing about thick data is that it reveals that if you understand the motives, like the reasoning behind a tiny small group of community people who are in a particular positioning, right? Low income, precarity, everyday wage laborers, that can be scaled and resonated across different cultures. It cuts through, just like, an upper class Indian will have a lot more in common maybe with someone in the US than maybe with their servants, right? Like, so that is what I'm talking about, is that there's a scalability in nuance, but there's less of a scalability in the flattening of understanding.
Hey, thanks. Sonal, do you see any other question coming up? Or Menka?
Just to add one thing that kind of shows up on the poll, and Payal couldn't resist but jump in. I don't know if you were able to see the results of the poll and what they feel about this term user research. Turns out that a vast majority of them agree that you cannot create a wow if you really ask the users what they want, right? And so how do you now apply the field of anthropology and psychology in kind of figuring out what even users don't know themselves? What's your special tip for folks to create that wow factor using user research? Or is that even possible?
Yeah, so it's really, I think this is very much. I was listening to the presenter before, right, and he talked about the want, and he said, "Don't ask them what they want," because the Ford example, and I actually disagree, because you have to ask them what they want. It's too condescending to assume, right? I mean, if you're in a relationship, do you want to keep guessing what's in the mind of your wife or husband? It helps. The first step in communication is just ask, what do you want, right? Now, that the question is, you don't stop there. As a designer, you're a translator of the want. So your job as a wow is not, the user is not going to deliver it on a platter, right? And so you're asking them the wrong questions about what you want in terms of, yes, you're not listening keenly, right? Because you have to also observe. You're not listening just in terms of what they're saying. You need to observe the context within which they're saying it. You go and ask a woman surrounded by her family members saying, what do you want? Are you happy serving your mother-in-law? And she's like, of course, I love it. I hand over my mobile phone to my brother so he can play video games while I clean up his room. So sure, you're not going to learn much. So, it's where you ask, what do you want? How you ask it. On TikTok, they are constantly these sort of, hashtags itself is a signal of what people want, right? We're just not listening in the right way. That's the thing. And also, by the way, here's another sort of devil's advocate. You don't need to wow. The wow factor is why you're not being able to compete, because that's because we are thinking in terms of deep resources. The Apple can wow, but how did China rise? They rose because they decided of a good enough technologies. That's how they broke into a market, because they came up with good enough technologies for segments of population which were constantly ignored by the wow, because they're like, yeah, they don't even have the aesthetic, they don't have this. We're not going to cater to the majority of the world's population because we can't figure out what can wow them, right? And that's why China has managed to win over India.
It's very interesting. So in your view, and obviously it's a big debate that would take its own time, and today may not be a good one. But just to summarize, what you're saying is, don't necessarily go for wow. There's another option of delighting the customer without the wow.
Yeah, like I'll give you an instance, right? So I in one of my fieldwork, we were trying to come up with a corpus of like songs. This was one of the first projects I'd done in Kuppam. And you're competing with Tollywood songs, which are professionalized, etc. And we were trying to create a corpus of folk songs. Okay, so this was a way we wanted it because the government said you can't establish this project unless you do something good. So like, sure, okay. And we did it, and it was mediocre because we don't have the deep budget and it was a CSR initiative. But the uptake was really, really high because there was few people professionalizing their folk songs. At that time, Gadar was going around, singing his lungs out, and he was super popular. And, so we released a mediocre product out there, and it was consumed as if it was candy. So I actually believe that if you get into a market and even you give something where there's nothing, right? I'm not saying that you have to dumb it down. I mean, the idea is you need to think, because it is becoming a competitive space. As I brought up, many of these companies are already looking at the NBU market. So my question is not whether you should or shouldn't look at it. My question is, how can you compete with deep pockets, right? Like Spotify and like Facebook.
So yeah. Speaking of speaking of deep pockets, not just going to lose that train of thought. If you look at the second question, and it looks like about a third of them who did select an answer, and of course this was a question I think was purposely created around myths. But if you look at a third of them, they're saying, hey, look, it's too expensive for startups to actually do user research, and perhaps not practical. What's your quick response to that in interest of time?
Well, you don't need to do it. You need to collaborate. You need to partner, right? And this is where there's a lot of people doing this kind of research. Yeah, and so I think partner with academia, for example, right? And academics need to transform their mindset. The younger academics are very geared towards industry. So we need to come up with a public-private partnership, especially smaller firms, right? So it doesn't have to, and like I said, the thick data is actually far less costly than big data in terms of data scraping and mining. So yeah.
Fascinating. Super. Well, looks like that's all about the time that we have. But back to you, Menka.
Thank you, Pinkesh, and thank you, Payal. That was such a simple, straightforward, and wonderful session. Very thought-provoking. Thank you so much. We request you to take a quick feedback, audience.
While that happens, a big thank you, and if you could put up the virtual badge. Thanks a lot, Payal, for spending the time, and
Thank
truly
you. I know it's
appreciate.
really late for you guys, so thank you.
No, this is fascinating. At this late and with this many sessions, I think we still have about 300 people, listening and tuned in. So obviously, your magic is holding all us up.
I'm surprised people haven't got the Zoom fatigue. It's gonna become a right?
Yeah, I think
version maybe.
very, very insightful. Thanks a lot for
Thank you so much.
spending the time.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. So before we wind up for the day, let me announce the winner for the day, Mr. Natarajan. Natarajan, congratulations for the best question asked. We will be in touch with you with your gift soon. Now, please, I request you to scan this QR code and give us your testimonials. And again, you get to win some rewards. And yes, so this is our lineup for tomorrow. So please make sure that you're with us at 8 p.m. sharp. So as you can see, this is going to be another exciting day. And thank you for being with us. Hope you enjoyed the session tonight. And good night, everyone.